They say the Duke of Varros never raises his voice. He doesn't have to. Every room he enters goes quiet the way a forest goes quiet before a predator moves through it. Not from respect, not from admiration, but from something older and more honest than either. Fear. The pure animal kind that doesn't need a reason, the kind that lives in the spine before the mind catches up. Lady Evelina Arden had spent 22 years learning to breathe through that fear. She had never fully managed it. But nothing in those 22 years had prepared her for a cathedral soaked in blood, a father's treason written in black ink, and the only man she had ever truly despised stepping through fire to tell her the world she thought she understood had never existed at all. Stay until the end. What's coming will change how you see everything. So, the morning it all broke open began the way most catastrophic mornings do, quietly, with ordinary light. Autumn had come to the capital city of Valdenmere the way it always did, in a slow surrender of color, the great oaks along the processional avenue bleeding rust and amber into streets still warm from summer. Evelina stood at the narrow window of her private chamber in Arden House and watched the city prepare itself for the day, the vendors rolling carts across the cobblestones, the baker 2 streets over already sending the smell of bread through the cold air, the palace towers catching the first pale edge of sun against a sky the color of old pewter. She had slept 4 hours, maybe less. The documents were still spread across her writing desk behind her. She hadn't touched them since the second hour past midnight, when she'd read the final page for the 3rd time and sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling until the words stopped making the kind of sense that could be undone by disbelief. Lord Aldrich Arden, Duke of the Northern Reach, primary signatory to the Compact of the Crimson Seal. Her father's name. Her father's seal. Her father's handwriting in the margin notes, precise and practiced. The same hand that had signed her letters of introduction to court. The same hand that had written her name in the family register the day she was born. The compact itself was 15 pages of careful, measured language that amounted to one thing when you stripped the legal architecture away from it: a plan to murder Emperor Hadric Norval in his own throne room and place Crown Prince Lucian on the seat of empire before the Senate could convene an emergency session. The signatories had already divided the spoils. The date was set. The mechanisms were already in motion. And buried in the final annex, written in a different hand she didn't recognize, was a single clause that had kept her sitting in that chair until her legs went numb. The Arden girl to be transferred formally to His Imperial Highness Prince Lucian as contracted consort upon completion of Phase 1. All Arden holdings, titles, and associated political instruments to pass to the crown upon signing of the marital contract. Lord Arden to retain ceremonial governance of the Northern Reach as appointed governor. Duration, life, transferred, like a parcel of land, like an inheritance, like something that could be contracted and delivered on a timeline. Evelina turned from the window. She looked at the documents without touching them. Outside, someone was singing in the street below. A working song, tuneless and cheerful. The kind of sound that belonged to a morning that had nothing to do with what she was standing in the middle of. She had found them by accident. Or she had thought it was accident at the time, though she was already beginning to revise that assessment. She'd gone into her father's study 3 nights ago to retrieve the household ledger for the estate manager, and the hidden compartment behind the secondary bookcase had been left fractionally open. Not open enough to be careless, but open enough for someone who knew the room intimately, who had watched her father work in that study since childhood and had long ago learned the way his hands moved when he thought he was alone. She had told herself she wasn't going to read them. She'd told herself that twice before she sat down. Now she knew. And knowing had its own weight, a specific kind of heaviness that didn't lift when you looked away. The knock at her door was her maid, Sarah, bringing the morning tray. Evelina composed her face before she said, "Come in." She was good at composing her face. She had been doing it since she was a child in court with her father's hand on her shoulder and his instruction in her ear. Smile when I smile, be still when I am still, give them nothing they can use. She understood now what he'd been preparing her for. The thought made her feel sick. "The Morning Post, my lady," Sarah said, setting the tray down and pulling a folded note from her apron pocket with the practiced neutrality of long service. "Delivered by private courier, not the household staff. He said it was urgent." Evelina took it. The seal was plain wax, no crest, just a thumbprint pressed into dark red. She broke it. The note inside was 3 lines. The assembly has been moved to today. Your father expects you at the Arden Cathedral for the midday gathering. Come dressed for ceremony. No signature. But the handwriting was her father's. She set the note down on the breakfast tray next to the untouched cup of tea and looked at the candle on her nightstand, the flame burning steady and small in the still air. Tell the stablemaster I'll need the carriage within the hour, she said. And Sarah, pack a bag. A light one. Leave it in my wardrobe. Sarah looked at her. The maid had been with the family since before Evelina was born, and she was not a woman given to asking questions she already knew the answers to. Yes, my lady, she said. The Arden Cathedral stood at the edge of the noble quarter on the site of an older structure that had burned down 2 generations ago, rebuilt in gray stone and black iron into something that looked less like a place of gathering than a fortress with decorative ambitions. The family had maintained it for 3 centuries, through marriages and deaths and the various political realignments that came with surviving long enough in the empire's upper tier. It had seen coronation witnesses, treaty signings, the private meetings that the Senate's official record would never acknowledge. It was a good place for a conspiracy to complete itself. Her father had always been precise about venues. Evelina arrived 20 minutes before midday. She had dressed carefully, the formal dark gray of house colors, her hair done plainly, nothing that would read as preparation for an occasion. She left her maid at the carriage with the light bag and a quiet word and walked the last 100 yards alone. The cathedral doors were guarded by men in Arden livery she didn't recognize. Not the household guard she'd grown up watching. New faces, heavier builds, the kind of stillness that came from military training rather than ceremonial posting. They checked her in without speaking and directed her through the outer hall. The interior was already occupied. 30 men, maybe 40, arranged with the careful casualness of people who were pretending they hadn't been strategically placed. She knew some of them, minor lords from the northern territories, 2 senators whose names appeared in the compact's signature pages, a general she had met twice at imperial functions, whose presence here was either very significant or very deliberate, probably both. Crown Prince Lucian stood near the far end of the central hall in conversation with her father. He was 26, the prince, with the kind of face that worked well in portraiture and less well in direct light. Handsome enough, certainly. He had the look of a man who had learned from childhood that he was the most important person in any room he entered and had never been sufficiently contradicted. Her father saw her first. He crossed the floor in the measured, unhurried stride of a man who had arranged this moment and was satisfied with how it was proceeding. Evelina. He took her hands in both of his the way he always did when there were people watching. I'm glad you came. You didn't give me much notice, she said. No, he agreed. I didn't. Lord Aldrich Arden was 61 years old and looked 50. He was a man built like a strategic asset, solid, carefully maintained, capable of presenting whatever face a situation required. He had silver gray hair worn short, a narrow beard, and eyes that Evelina had spent years trying to read and never fully succeeded with. She had always told herself it was the natural opacity of a political man. She understood now it was simpler than that. He had things to hide. He'd always had things to hide. The prince is looking forward to speaking with you, her father said. I imagine he is. She kept her voice level. Father, can we speak privately? Before this proceeds any further? Something shifted in his expression, just fractionally. There will be time for that. I'd rather now. Evelina. He squeezed her hands, the gentle warning pressure she'd learned to interpret from childhood. There's no need for friction. Today is a good day. A day we've been preparing for. I found your study open, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. The pressure on her hands changed. Did you? He said. I read the annex. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face did something she had never seen it do in 22 years. Not shame, not quite guilt. Something more pragmatic than either, a recalculation, the specific expression of a man who has encountered a variable he'd accounted for and had decided in advance how to manage. Then you understand what today is, he said. I understand what you've arranged, she said. I don't understand how you could… Later. He released her hands. We'll speak later, and I'll explain what I can. Right now, come and meet the prince properly. You've only been introduced formally. He's not what court gossip makes him. She looked at him. 22 years of her life sat between them, and she could feel the weight of it differently now. The shape of it changed, not larger, but somehow denser, the way something familiar becomes strange when you understand what it was made of. I know what he is, she said. I've read the compact. Her father's jaw tightened. Then you know how important it is that you behave sensibly. What's done is set in motion, Evelina. Your place in the outcome is secure. That's what I've worked for. My place, she repeated. You mean the clause in the annex? I mean your future, he said, which is more than most daughters of ambitious men get written into the terms. She stared at him. He meant it. That was the part that hit hardest. He genuinely meant it as a reassurance. Excuse me, she said, and walked away from him before she said something that couldn't be unsaid in a room full of men who would remember it. She found the side hall by memory. The cathedral's eastern wing had been her territory as a child, the one part of the building her father used only for storage, where the stone was cold and the light came through narrow windows in long, pale bars. She had spent hours here as a girl, reading and hiding and doing the ordinary business of being a child in a house where childhood was not especially valued. She stood in the half-dark and pressed her back against the stone wall and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the full weight of what she was standing in the middle of. She counted them deliberately. Then she stopped. The bag was still at the carriage. Sarah was still at the carriage. The question was whether she could reach them. She pushed off the wall and started toward the service corridor that ran parallel to the main hall and out to the building's rear, the route she'd used as a child to avoid her father's gatherings when she wanted to disappear without being missed. She heard the first scream before she reached the corridor's end. Not a social scream, not surprise or alarm. The specific, short, cut-off kind that meant something had happened to a person and they hadn't been able to finish the sound. She stopped. Then a second sound. Stone against stone, weight against weight, the heavy percussion of bodies falling or being thrown. Then shouting from the main hall, overlapping voices, and under it, steady and wrong, the smell of smoke. She didn't move toward the sound. She moved away from it, fast, keeping low, her back against the wall the way her father had drilled her years ago on the logic of architectural cover. She didn't think about what was happening in the main hall. She thought about the rear service door and the distance to the carriage and the weight of the bag Sarah had packed. The service door was blocked. 2 men in dark clothing had taken positions in the corridor, neither in Arden livery, neither with the look of household staff. One of them saw her the same moment she saw them. Lady Arden, he said. Not a greeting, an identification. She turned back the other way and ran. Teen. The cathedral had 7 interior spaces connected by 3 crossing corridors. Evelina knew all of them. The men following her did not. That was the only advantage she had, and she spent it in the first 3 minutes, putting 2 turns and a locked antechamber door between her and the sound of pursuit. She locked herself in the antechamber and stood in the dark and listened. The smoke smell was stronger now. Something was burning in the main hall, or near it. The shouting had gone ragged, the overlapping quality of it changing into something with a different register, the particular chaos of people who had stopped arguing and started dying. Her father had planned a coup. Someone had planned something else. She pressed her ear to the door and heard footsteps in the corridor outside, too controlled for flight, too deliberate for ordinary movement. The specific quality of someone searching, moving through space with professional attention. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A pause. Then a voice through the wood, low and even, not raised for the benefit of the room. Lady Arden, open the door. She knew that voice. She had heard it exactly twice in her life, at formal court functions where its owner was a mandatory presence that most attendees rearranged their evening around to avoid. Low, with the quality of something under significant compression. The kind of voice that had never needed to be anything other than what it was. She had spent years afraid of that voice, She had told herself it was irrational, that she was responding to reputation and rumor and the way other people moved around him like water around a fixed stone. She had told herself she was smarter than her fear. Her hands were shaking on the door bolt. "I can hear you," the voice said. "The men who were in the service corridor are not a problem anymore. The door behind you leads to the eastern transept, and there are 2 more in the transept with a clear line to the exterior door. Open this one." She opened the door. Duke Kael Varros stood in the corridor in black field armor, the kind worn for actual combat, not ceremony. There was blood on his right gauntlet, not his. He held no weapon at the moment, but she could see a short blade sheathed at his hip and something longer on his back that she registered as a sword without looking directly at. He was taller than she remembered from the court functions. He always was when she was close enough to measure it honestly. 36 years old, though he didn't especially look it, not because of youth exactly, but because his face had the quality of something that had been very hard for a very long time and had stopped registering the passage of time as a meaningful variable. Dark hair, close cut. Eyes that were gray or dark brown depending on the light, currently gray. He looked at her the way he always looked at her. She had never been able to name what that look was. She had tried. She had called it assessment, calculation, the professional evaluation of a political asset. None of those names had ever fit correctly. "You're not hurt," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "Good." He looked past her into the antechamber, then back to the corridor in both directions. "We're leaving. Stay close and don't stop moving unless I stop. If I stop, get behind me." "What is happening in the main hall?" "Your father's associates ran into a counter-operation," he said. "It will be finished within the next few minutes." "Whose counter-operation?" He looked at her directly. "Mine," he said. She stared at him. "We don't have time for this conversation here," he said. "There's a door at the northwest corner that opens to the alley. My men are holding the alley." "Your men," she said. "Yes. The men in the service corridor were sent here to take you," he said. "They were part of your father's auxiliary. They weren't part of the planned event. Someone modified the arrangement." "Who?" "I have a credible hypothesis," he said. "I'll tell you when we're out of the building." She looked at him, at the blood on his gauntlet, at the precise stillness of him in a building that was filling with smoke and the sounds of violence. He was completely, absolutely calm, in the way that something is calm when it has already made every relevant decision and is simply executing. "You knew about the compact," she said. "Yes." "How long?" 8 months, he said. "Move." She moved. The alley was cold and smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. 4 men in dark operational gear held the perimeter with the practiced invisibility of long-trained soldiers. They didn't look at Evelina. They looked everywhere else, in the careful rotating pattern of people maintaining tactical awareness. Kael moved her through them without pausing, through the alley and into the side street beyond, where 2 closed carriages sat with their teams held still by drivers who were very clearly not ordinary drivers. He opened the carriage door and held it. She got in. He followed, and the door closed behind him, and the carriage was moving before she'd fully processed the sequence. She sat across from him in the enclosed dark. The sounds of the cathedral fell away behind them. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees. "My father," she said. "He was in the main hall when the situation changed," Kael said. "My men had instructions to preserve him. He's alive." "And the prince?" "Not in the cathedral. The prince was never going to be in the cathedral. Today was a preliminary function." He paused. "He's at the palace, behind significant security." She looked at him. In the dim light of the moving carriage, his face had the same quality as always, closed and precise, giving nothing away except information he'd decided to release. "You've been watching all of this," she said. "You knew for 8 months." "Yes." "And you waited." "I needed the full roster of signatories," he said. "Partial action would have driven the operation underground. I needed the assembly to occur." "You needed the assembly to occur?" she said. "You used it. You used the fact that I was going to be there, that I was contracted to... She stopped. Her voice had done something she hadn't authorized. She steadied it. The annex. You knew about the annex. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. The carriage moved through the city. She could hear Valdenmere outside, ordinary and oblivious, a morning going about its business. The baker's street, the vendors, the song. You could have told me, she said, 8 months ago. You could have... No, he said. Why not? Because you would have confronted your father, he said, and he would have accelerated the timeline and altered the approach, and I would have lost 6 months of intelligence and the ability to execute a clean counter. Clean, she said. Cleaner, he said, than the alternative. She looked at his hands. The blood on the gauntlet had dried. He hadn't cleaned it. She didn't think he had noticed it. Where are you taking me? She said. Nightgrave Citadel, he said. It's the only location in the Empire where I can guarantee your security for the next 2 weeks while the counter operation is completed. You're taking me to your fortress. Yes. Without asking. I'm asking now, he said. Do you want to go back? She thought about the cathedral, the men in the service corridor, the clause in the annex transferred formally to His Imperial Highness. No, she said. He nodded once and turned to look out the carriage window and said nothing more. She watched him in the gray light and felt the fear she had carried for 22 years do something unexpected. It didn't disappear. It was too old and too thoroughly embedded to simply go, but it shifted, very slightly, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room, changing the shape of the space without removing anything. She did not know what to do with that. They changed carriages twice before reaching the city's eastern gate, a precaution Kael executed with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had done this before. Many times. Evelina watched the process and understood, somewhere below conscious analysis, that she was watching a man who had spent years building and maintaining operational infrastructure for exactly this kind of moment. He'd been preparing, she thought, not for 8 months, for longer. The second carriage was larger, built for distance travel, with a brazier bolted to the floor that one of Kael's men lit before they boarded. The road east toward the Varros territories was 3 days at hard pace, 2 if the weather held and the horses were changed at regular intervals. Kael's people clearly had arrangements along the route. She slept for 2 hours somewhere in the first afternoon, against her own intention, the accumulated sleeplessness of 3 nights collapsing into unconsciousness without asking her permission. When she woke, the light through the carriage window had the amber quality of late afternoon, and Kael was sitting across from her with papers spread on the fold-down writing board, reading with the absorbed completeness of a man who could do nothing partially. He had taken the gauntlets off. His hands were clean. She sat up and didn't say anything. He glanced at her once, briefly, then back to the papers. "There's food in the case under your seat," he said. "Eat something." "I'm not hungry." "You haven't eaten since yesterday," he said. "You'll be useless to yourself if you don't manage basic requirements." She thought about arguing with this. She thought about the specific irritation of being managed by a man who had upended her entire life and was now telling her to eat something. Then she opened the case under the seat and found bread and dried meat and a small clay bottle of something hot that turned out to be broth, and ate mechanically while the carriage rolled east. "Who modified the arrangement?" she said. "The service corridor men. You said someone changed the plan." He didn't look up from the papers. A faction within the prince's inner circle that wasn't party to the original compact. They wanted the operation to go differently. Specifically, they wanted you held separately. "Held," she said. "The prince's leverage over your father is most effective if you're not in your father's custody," he said. "They calculated that delivering you directly to the palace before Phase 1 completed would remove a potential complication." She absorbed this. "My father didn't know." "No," he said. "The prince was running 2 operations simultaneously. He's less straightforward than he presents." "And the emperor? He's not aware of the full scope," Kael said. "He's aware of civil instability. He's not aware of how close his son is to acting." "Are you going to tell him?" Kael looked at her then, fully, setting the papers down. What I'm going to do, he said, is give you the complete picture of the political situation over the next day. Not because I believe you need to be managed or informed on a need-to-know basis, but because you are directly relevant to multiple calculations and you are significantly less useful to yourself when operating without information. She stared at him. That is the most impersonal thing anyone has ever said to me about keeping me alive. Something happened in his face. Not quite what she would have called an expression, more like the distant suggestion of one, a faint adjustment around the eyes that might, in someone else, have been the preliminary to wry acknowledgement. I'm told I lack warmth, he said. You're told correctly, she said. The carriage rolled on. The amber light shifted to gray. The Emperor has 18 months to live, Kael said. The court physicians have known for 6 months. It is not public information. Lucien is aware. Your father is aware. The compact was built around the expected succession, accelerated by parties who were unwilling to wait for the natural timeline. She was quiet for a moment. And you've known? Yes. For how long? He paused, just fractionally. Longer than I knew about the compact, he said. She looked at him. You've been positioning for this. I've been preparing, he said. Yes. For the Civil War. For the outcome, he said. Civil war is probably unavoidable at this point. What happens after it is not inevitable. That's what I've been working toward. She thought about the documents, the careful language of the compact, the division of the spoils, the men arranged in the cathedral with their specific casual positioning. She thought about 8 months of Kael watching it from somewhere above the mechanism, pulling threads she couldn't see, letting the machine run until it reached the configuration he needed. You're not just the Empire's sword, she said. He looked at her. Everyone calls you that, she said. The Black Sovereign, the Emperor's right arm, the sword that the throne points. But that's not what you are. He was quiet. You're the one who decides where the throne points, she said. The carriage hit a rut in the road, the brazier shifted fractionally, and the light inside changed. I've been called worse, he said. It should have been a deflection. She recognized the shape of it. But the way he said it had a quality she hadn't anticipated, something underneath the flatness, something that had been under compression for a very long time and was pressing slightly against the surface. She filed it away without knowing exactly why. Outside, the Empire's eastern provinces spread out in the darkening afternoon, fields and forests, and the distant suggestion of mountains that grew larger as they moved toward them. Somewhere 3 days ahead, built into the volcanic rock of the Varros Range, a fortress was waiting for her. Black stone and iron gates and the household of the most feared man in Norval. She had never in her life imagined being here. She had never imagined being grateful for the presence of someone she'd spent 22 years afraid of. She had never imagined sitting across from Duke Kael Varros in a carriage moving east at speed and feeling under the fear and the anger and the raw, displaced grief of a world turned inside out, something that she couldn't name yet and wasn't ready to examine. She looked out the window. The mountains came closer. And in the capital behind them, in the ruins of a cathedral, in the closed rooms of a palace where a prince was recalculating the damage to his plans, in the scattered crisis of a conspiracy that had just lost a significant piece of its infrastructure, a war was beginning to find its shape. Evelina Arden had spent 22 years being moved by other people's plans. She hadn't decided yet what she intended to do about that, but she was starting to think about it. Goak, the outrider caught them at the first relay station, 2 hours into the eastern road, riding hard enough that the horse was lathered white when he pulled up. He dismounted before the animal fully stopped and handed Kael a sealed dispatch through the carriage window with the economy of someone who had been trained not to speak unless asked. Kael broke the seal and read. The quality of his stillness changed. She'd been watching him long enough in the past hours to understand that he had more than one register of stillness, that they meant different things, that the controlled absence of expression he presented by default was not the same as the harder, colder absence that arrived when something required a different level of management. This was the second kind. He read the dispatch twice, folded it once with precise, deliberate hands, put it inside his coat. What happened? She said. He looked at her. And what she saw in his face in that moment was not what she expected. Not calculation, not the neutral assessment of a political variable, something she had no name for, something that looked, from the right angle, like a man encountering the specific weight of a thing he had feared and managed and prepared for, and had not, in the end, fully prepared for. "The Emperor," she said. Not a question. "No," he said. "Your father." She went very still. "He didn't stay in the cathedral," Kael said, his voice careful in the way of someone managing the delivery of information that will cause damage. "My men held him until 30 minutes after we left. He requested legal counsel, which I hadn't authorized denial of. In the interim, he had a conversation with a member of the Senate legal staff who was on site, and then he was gone." "Gone," she said. "He had a secondary exit route," Kael said. "I had underestimated his contingency planning." The carriage was quiet. "Where is he?" she said. Kael was silent for a long moment. "He's moving north," he said, "toward Ironcrest." Ironcrest Fortress. The Arden family seat in the Northern Reach, built 700 years ago by her great-great-grandfather and held by the family through every political upheaval the empire had seen since. Remote, heavily defensible, supplied for a siege. "He's going to run the coup from the north," she said. "He's going to try," Kael said. She sat with it. The carriage moved through the darkening afternoon, east toward mountains that were the wrong direction from everything she was thinking about. She was thinking about her father's face in the cathedral corridor, the recalculation she'd seen there, the expression of a man who had encountered a variable and decided how to manage it. He'd had a contingency for being caught. Of course he had. He'd had a contingency for everything except her. "The compact is still active," she said. "Most of it," Kael said. "The cathedral assembly was a preliminary coordination. Phase 1 hasn't executed yet. The prince is still positioned." She looked at him. "And I'm in a carriage 3 days from Nightgrave while my father goes north to start a war." "Yes," Kael said. "You didn't account for this." He met her eyes directly, without the flinch of a man unwilling to accept a correct assessment. "No," he said. For 22 years she had been afraid of this man. For 22 years the mere mention of his name had done something to her breathing and the way she held herself in a room. The Black Sovereign. The cold warlord who broke generals over his knee and walked through other men's violence like weather. She looked at him now, in the gray light of an accelerating crisis, and saw for the first time the edge of what it actually cost. "Then we need to change the plan," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "We do." And somewhere to the north, in a fortress older than the empire that had eventually swallowed it, Lord Aldrich Arden was sending riders. The relay station was a stone building the size of a barn, functional and deliberately unmemorable, the kind of structure that existed in the empire's infrastructure the way tendons existed in a body, essential and invisible until something went wrong. Kael's men had it staffed with 4 people who were not, Evelina noticed, the kind of relay workers who discussed their employment at taverns. Kael was already out of the carriage and moving before it fully stopped. She followed without being told. Inside, a table had been cleared and a map spread with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. The outrider who'd brought the dispatch was talking in low, rapid sentences to a woman in traveling clothes whose posture suggested a military background that civilian dress had not managed to disguise. Kael listened without interrupting, his eyes on the map, one hand braced on the table edge. Evelina moved to the opposite side of the table and looked at the map. The empire spread out in ink and parchment, Valdenmere at the center, the northern territories above it like a raised fist, iron crest marked in the older cartographer's style with the Arden family crest beside the name. The volcanic range where Nightgrave Citadel sat was 3 days east. The northern road to Ironcrest from Valdenmere was 4 days at standard pace, 2.5 if someone was running. Her father had a 2-hour lead. "He'll reach Ironcrest in 60 hours, she said, maybe 55 if he changed horses at the northern gate station. The woman across the table looked at her. Kael looked at her. "The northern gate station keeps 6 reserve teams," Evelina said. "My father endowed the station master's appointment 12 years ago. He won't be slowed there." Kael's eyes moved back to the map. A pause so brief most people wouldn't have measured it. "Maret?" he said to the woman. Adjust the northern intercept for 55 hours. Maret nodded once and left the table. Evelina looked at Kael. He was still looking at the map, tracing something with his eyes that she couldn't read. You have an intercept team, she said. I had one positioned for a different contingency, he said. It will serve. What was the original contingency? Your father being transported under custody to a holding location in the mid-provinces. And now? He looked up. Now he needs to be stopped before he reaches the fortress walls. Iron Crest fortified is a 6-month siege. I don't have 6 months. She understood the shape of what he wasn't saying. The Emperor had 18 months. A 6-month siege against her father in the north, while the prince still sat at the palace with an intact conspiracy and a throne to inherit, was not a sequence that ended well for the Empire, or for her. What do you need from me? She said. Something in his face adjusted very slightly. Not surprise exactly, closer to recalibration. He had expected her to ask a different question first. She could see him revising whatever answer he'd prepared. Your father's secondary defenses at Ironcrest, he said. The fortress plans the Empire has on record are 40 years old. The renovations your family made in the last 2 decades aren't documented. You want me to give you the layout? I want whatever you know, he said, which may be more than you think you know. Kate. They stayed at the relay station for 3 hours. Kael worked through 2 more dispatches and a conversation with a man who arrived on a hard-ridden horse and left on a fresh one without once making eye contact with Evelina, which she took to mean that she was either irrelevant to his purpose or that Kael had standing instructions about how his people behaved around her. She spent the first hour at the table with Maret, going through Ironcrest's layout from memory. The Eastern Well. The secondary grain stores her father had built into the cliff face 16 years ago that weren't on any official inventory. The passage from the lower garrison to the cliff road that her mother had used to leave the fortress unseen when she needed to visit the villages in the valley below. The thought of her mother arrived without warning, and she let it pass without examining it. She'd learned that skill early: let it pass, file it somewhere accessible, come back to it when the situation allowed for something other than function. Maret was efficient and asked good questions and had the quality of someone who had been trusted with important work long enough that the importance no longer visibly affected her. Evelina found her easier to deal with than she'd expected. In the second hour, Kael came and sat across from her with the map and added his own annotations to what she'd told Maret. He asked 3 specific questions about the garrison wall's eastern section that told her he already had partial intelligence on Ironcrest and was filling in gaps rather than starting from nothing. She answered them. He noted the answers without comment. In the third hour, she sat alone near the fire while Kael handled operational communications and let herself think about her father. Not the document version of him. Not the cathedral version. The version she had grown up with. The man who had taught her to read maps because he believed women who couldn't navigate were women who could be trapped. The man who had reviewed her correspondence as a child, not to censor it, but to teach her what language revealed about the writer's intentions. The man who had, she now understood, been preparing her for a world he intended to hand her to in a specific configuration, like a field tilled and fenced before the planting. He had loved her. She didn't doubt that. What she was revising was whether love, as her father practiced it, had ever been separable from ownership. She looked at the fire and understood something that had the quality of a door closing. She was never going to get the version of her father that made the annex make sense in a way she could live with. There wasn't one. She had been looking for it since the second hour past midnight 3 days ago, and it didn't exist. That was going to have to be enough to move on. The second carriage was faster than the first, lighter built and with a different team, and Kael had it moving east before the relay station's light was fully behind them. The night came down over the road like a dropped cloth. Evelina slept again. 3 hours this time, genuinely and without resistance. When she woke, Kael was still awake across from her, working by the small carriage lamp, papers arranged with the spatial precision of someone who thought in organized systems. "Don't you sleep?" she said. "Later," he said. "When is later?" "When the situation allows for it." She straightened and pulled her coat tighter. The brazier was still burning, but the night had pushed cold air under the carriage doors. You said you'd tell me the full picture, she said. You haven't. He looked at her. Then he set the papers down on the writing board with deliberate care, the gesture of a man choosing to give something his complete attention. The compact has 12 primary signatories, he said. 8 of them were in the cathedral today. 4 were not. Those 4 hold significant military commands, 2 in the eastern provinces, 1 controlling the Central River Road, 1 at the Imperial Naval Station on the southern coast. The naval station, she said? Yes. That's the supply line for the northern territories. Among other things, he said, if the naval signatory activates before I've neutralized the others, your father receives resupply at Ironcrest regardless of what my intercept team accomplishes. He can hold the fortress indefinitely. She thought about that, about the shape of a war that had no clear endpoint, grinding across the northern territories while the emperor died in the palace and the prince maneuvered in the capital. You've been holding the empire together, she said. He looked at her steadily. The emperor has been holding the empire together, he said. I've been supplementing his structural weaknesses. That's a careful way to say it. I'm a careful man, he said. She watched him. The lamplight moved with the carriage's motion, and his face shifted in and out of shadow with it. He looked tired, she realized. Not the way people looked tired when they hadn't slept, but the way they looked when they had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the weight had settled into the structure of them so thoroughly that it was no longer distinguishable from the rest. You've known me my entire life, she said, in some capacity. You've known about my father, about his alliances, about what he was building toward. You've been watching my family since you were 14, he said, since your mother died. The fire in the brazier made a small sound. The carriage moved through the dark. My mother, she said. He was quiet. She died of fever, Evelina said. That's what we were told. A fever that came on in autumn and progressed. The physicians were very certain. He said nothing. The carriage moved. Kael, she said. And it was the first time she had used his name without a title, without the formal distance of address. And she heard it as she said it and felt something shift in the air of the small enclosed space between them. He looked at her. My mother didn't die of fever, she said. It wasn't a question. She knew it wasn't a question. She had known it since the relay station, since she'd been going through the Ironcrest layout with Maret, and her mind had gone to the passage from the garrison to the cliff road, the passage her mother had used to leave unseen, and she'd wondered for the first time in 8 years why her mother had needed to leave unseen, and what she might have been carrying out of that fortress that required invisibility. Kael held her gaze. His jaw tightened once, very slightly, the only visible break in a face that had been still for hours. No, he said. She didn't. The lamp swung on its hook. The carriage rolled on. Evelina looked at the floor between them and felt the specific, dimensionless weight of a grief she had already finished and was now being asked to start again from a different position. Her mother at 38, vital and sharp-minded and difficult in all the ways that Evelina had inherited, and her father had spent years managing in them both. Her mother in the autumn light of the Ironcrest courtyard, which was the last clear image Evelina had before the illness had taken her out of the common spaces and into the sick room. How long have you known? She said. Long enough, he said. Long enough that I couldn't prove it in a way that would hold in an imperial court against a man with your father's legal resources and political protection. But you know. Yes, he said. I know. She looked up at him. Is that why? After she died? Is that why you started watching? He was quiet for a moment. Partly, he said. What's the other part? He looked at her, and the expression on his face was not nothing, as she'd been learning to read him well enough to understand. It was something held at significant compression, something he had been holding for long enough that the holding had become indistinguishable from intention. That conversation, he said, can happen when you're in a secure location and you've slept properly and eaten 2 consecutive meals. She stared at him. You are genuinely the most infuriating person I have ever... Yes, he said. I'm told that as well. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It surprised her. The sound surprised him too, she thought, from the fractional way his attention sharpened. She turned back to the window. The Empire's dark countryside moved past. "Tell me about the 4 military signatories," she said, "specifically the naval station. What's your timeline on neutralizing him?" He picked up his papers. 7 days, he said, "if everything performs as modeled. And if it doesn't? Then 14, he said, which means the northern situation becomes complicated." "Complicated," she said. "Difficult," he said, "which I prefer not to allow." She looked at his hands on the papers. The dried blood was gone, cleaned at the relay station, but she could see the old scar tissue on his right hand, the knuckles, the base of the thumb, the kind of accumulated damage that accumulated slowly over years of the kind of work that left marks. She thought about 14 years old, her mother in the autumn courtyard. Kael Varros, 22 at the time, already one of the Empire's most dangerous military instruments, watching from whatever distance he'd chosen, choosing to watch, choosing to stay. She didn't understand it yet, but she was starting to understand that there was something to understand, which was more than she'd had yesterday. They reached the edge of the Varros range on the second morning, the mountains rising out of the plains like something the earth had pushed up from underneath in a moment of decision. The volcanic rock was black and red-gray, ancient cooling made permanent, and the fortress sat in the upper third of the primary peak like it had always been part of the stone. Nightgrave's citadel. She had seen it once at distance, from the Imperial Road years ago. It looked different from the approach road. Larger, more deliberate. Built not to impress but to function, every wall and tower positioned for sightlines and defense rather than aesthetic effect. The gates opened as they arrived, operated by people she couldn't see from mechanisms she couldn't identify. The inner courtyard was gray stone and controlled activity, staff moving with the quiet efficiency of a household that had been run on operational principles for so long that it had absorbed them entirely. Kael was out of the carriage before it stopped. She followed. A man met them in the courtyard, older, with the bearing of someone who had served in this house for decades. He spoke to Kael in a low voice, with the brevity of someone who had already assembled the relevant information and was delivering it without waste. Evelina caught 2 words, Senate and tonight. Kael turned to her. "There's been a development in the capital," he said. "I need an hour." "What development?" He looked at her steadily. "The prince has called an emergency Senate session. Tonight. He's named your father a traitor to the Empire and requested emergency executive powers." She stared at him. "He's turning on his own compact. He's cutting the parts of it that are no longer useful," Kael said. "With your father running north, Lucien doesn't need the Arden alliance anymore. He has enough Senate support to move independently. What he needs is to be the man who exposed the conspiracy rather than the man who led it." She understood the architecture of it immediately. It was elegant, in the cold way that betrayal could be elegant when it was executed cleanly. "He'll have my father declared an enemy of the state," she said, "which makes the Ironcrest situation a legal rebellion rather than a political dispute, which means the Empire's full military resources can be deployed to the north under emergency powers that he controls," Kael said. "Yes." "Under him," she said. "Not the Emperor." "The Emperor will sign whatever is put in front of him," Kael said. "His physicians have him on a regimen that affects his judgment. That's been managed carefully for 3 months. She looked at him. The morning light of Nightgrave's courtyard was cold and very clear. "And where does that leave you?" she said. He held her gaze. "It leaves me," he said, "as the only military power in the Empire that isn't currently operating under the prince's direct authority." "Then he'll come for you next." "Yes," Kael said, "he will." She stood in the courtyard of a fortress built into volcanic rock on the edge of the Empire's furthest territories, with war building in the north and a prince maneuvering in the capital, and her father's ghost moving through all of it, trailing damage she was only beginning to map. She looked at Kael. "The hour you need," she said. "Take it. Then I want everything. Every piece. Every calculation you've made about what happens next." He looked at her for a moment. Not the recalibrating look, not the operational assessment, something else. Something that had the quality of a decision being made about what to allow. "Everything," he said. "Yes," she said. I'm in this now. You made sure of that. So either I'm in it fully or I'm a liability. Which one do you want? The courtyard was very quiet. Fully, he said. And somewhere in the capital, in a Senate chamber filling with men who thought they understood the shape of the power moving through the empire, Crown Prince Lucien was standing at a podium with a carefully constructed truth and a lie buried inside it so precisely that no one in that room would find it until it was far too late. The hour Kael needed became 3. Evelina spent them in the war room on Nightgrave's second level, a long stone chamber with map tables running its full length and a window cut into the volcanic rock that looked out over the mountain approach with the kind of view that existed specifically to see trouble coming. She had been given access to everything: the operational files on the 4 military signatories, the intelligence reports on the Senate session, the dispatch traffic from the capital that Kael's network had been intercepting and decoding for months. She read all of it. By the second hour, she understood that what Kael had built over the past decade was not simply a military apparatus. It was an information architecture, layered and redundant, running through the empire's institutions the way water ran through stone, finding every crack, moving through every weakness, patient and invisible, and accumulating. He had sources in the palace domestic staff, in the Senate legal office, in the imperial postal relay system, in 3 of the 5 great noble houses. He had known about the compact not because someone had told him. He had known because he had built a system that made secrets difficult to keep. She was sitting with that understanding when he came in. He moved to the primary map table and stood across from her and began briefing without preamble, the way he did everything, as though the space between decision and action was something to be minimized rather than occupied. The Senate session lasted 4 hours, he said. Lucien got his emergency executive powers, modified version. The Senate gave him military authorization for the Northern campaign only, not capital-wide command. He'll push for the broader authority within the week. Who voted against the full authorization? Senators Vale, Corminth, and the Ardenmere bloc. He looked at the map. Which means Lucien knows who his obstacles are. They'll have accidents, she said. Within the month, he said. Yes. She looked at the dispatch traffic she'd been reading. Your naval signatory in the south, Korvath? He hasn't activated. Kael was quiet for a half-second. No. He was supposed to activate when Phase 1 executed. Phase 1 didn't execute cleanly. He should have been in contact with the remaining compact members by now. She looked up. But he hasn't moved. No, Kael said again. Why not? He looked at her across the map table, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled compression of a man managing information flow. Something harder. The expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he's been avoiding. I don't know, he said. The answer came the next morning, and it came from the direction Kael had been least prepared for. Marais brought it. She came into the war room at the first gray light of dawn and set a decoded dispatch on the table in front of Kael without speaking. Her face had the specific quality of a person who has already processed difficult information and is now simply functioning as its vehicle. Kael read it once, set it down, read it again. Then he was still in the way he had been still in the carriage when the first dispatch arrived. The harder register, the colder absence. Evelina was at the secondary map table, and she watched him and didn't speak. He looked up at Marais. Confirm the source. Confirmed through 2 independent channels, Marais said. The relay timing matches. It's clean. He nodded once. Marais left. Kael stood with his hands on the table and looked at the dispatch for a long moment. Then he turned to Evelina. Read it, he said. She crossed to the primary table and picked it up. The dispatch was 12 lines of decoded ciphertext. She read it through once and then read it again because the first reading hadn't fully resolved into meaning. General Edric Thane, commander of the Empire's 3rd Legion, Kael's second in the field for 11 years. The man who had executed every major campaign Kael had run in the past decade, who knew every operational detail of Nightgrave's defensive structure, who had access to the full roster of Kael's network sources and the decoding keys for the cipher system. Edric Thane had been in contact with Crown Prince Lucien for 6 months. The dispatch was a communication intercept from Thane's private courier, decoded by a source inside Thane's own household. The kind of irony that would have been almost clean if it weren't what it was. 6 months of correspondence, strategy discussions. The prince's understanding of Kael's full operational picture fed to him incrementally by the one man who had spent 11 years inside it. Thane knew about the Northern Intercept team. He knew about the naval signatory leverage. He knew about the 4 intelligence sources embedded in the Senate. He knew about Evelina. She set the dispatch down. "He's been feeding Lucien your playbook," she said. "Yes," Kael said. "For 6 months." "Yes." "The naval signatory not activating," she said. "Lucien told him to hold." "Yes." "So Korvath isn't a loose variable. He's a controlled one. Lucien is holding him in reserve." She looked up. "He's waiting for you to commit your Northern Intercept team. Then Korvath activates. Your father receives resupply, and the Northern campaign bogs down while Lucien moves on the capital." "Yes," Kael said. The war room was very quiet. Outside, the mountain wind was moving around the fortress walls with its particular low persistence. She looked at him. "How long have you known Thane?" "Since I was 23, Kael said. "He was a field commander under my first independent posting. He's been with me since the Veldmarch campaign." 13 years. She didn't say it. She could see from the set of his jaw that he was fully aware of the number. "Where is he now?" she said. 3 hours south of here," Kael said. "He left Nightgrave 4 days ago for what he told me was a resupply coordination at the southern garrison. He was intercepted this morning." "Intercepted," she said. "Alive?" "Yes. Are you going to keep him that way?" He looked at her. The question hung in the cold air of the war room between them, and she didn't take it back because she needed to know the answer. Not for judgment's sake, because it told her something about what the next 12 hours were going to look like, and she needed to know what she was standing in the middle of. "That depends on what he tells me," Kael said. They brought Thane in 2 hours later. He was a big man, Edric Thane, broad across the shoulders with the kind of physical presence that had served him well in field command. 50s, gray-haired, with a face that had the quality of old leather. Durable and worn, and not especially expressive under ordinary circumstances. He'd been in the field with Kael through 3 major campaigns and 2 border engagements. He walked into the war room without being dragged, which told Evelina something about how he had decided to play this. He looked at Kael first, then his eyes moved to Evelina, and he held her gaze for a moment with an assessment that was professional and cold, and told her clearly that he knew exactly what she was to this situation. "Sit," Kael said. Thane sat. Kael didn't sit. He stood at the map table with his hands loose at his sides and looked at Thane the way he looked at maps, with the total absence of feeling that meant complete attention. "Tell me when it started," Kael said. Thane looked at the table surface, a pause that was not hesitation. It was the pause of a man organizing what he'd already decided to say. 8 months ago, Thane said. Lucien approached through an intermediary, Senator Vale's personal courier. "Vale," Kael said. "Who voted against full emergency authorization yesterday?" "Vale's been playing both ends since before the compact was drafted," Thane said. "He's careful." "What did Lucien offer you?" Kael said. Thane looked up. "A governorship, full military command of the eastern provinces under the new imperial structure. Appointment with a 20-year charter. That's all." "It was enough," Thane said. Kael was quiet for a moment. "I gave you the 3rd Legion," he said. "I gave you the Veldmarch command when no one else thought you were ready for an independent posting. I gave you 11 years of—" "You gave me the best work of my career," Thane said. "And then you started making decisions I didn't agree with." The temperature in the room didn't change. Something else did. "What decisions?" Kael said. Thane's jaw tightened. "The Emperor is dying. You've known it for a year. You've been running a counter-operation against the Compact for 8 months. But you haven't moved against the Prince directly. You have the leverage. You have the network. You've had 3 separate operational windows in the past 6 months where you could have removed Lucien from the board cleanly." He paused. "You didn't take any of them." Kael said nothing. "Because of her," Thane said. His eyes moved to Evelina. Because the moment you move against the prince, the Arden alliance fractures and Lord Arden becomes a wild card. And suddenly the woman you've been running a decade of shadow operations to keep alive becomes the most exposed piece on the board. Evelina held his gaze and didn't look away. You bent the whole operation around protecting one person, Thane said, looking back at Kael. And that's not strategy. That's a liability dressed up as a principle. And you decided Lucian would make better use of the Empire, Kael said. I decided someone needed to make actual decisions, Thane said, instead of managing an endgame that never ends. Kael looked at him for a long moment, the specific look of a man who has known someone for a very long time and is in the process of permanently revising what that knowing means. The intercept team in the north, he said. You told Lucian their positions. Thane didn't answer, which was an answer. The 4 Senate sources, Kael said. You gave him their identities. Thane looked at the table. Are they alive? Kael said. 2 of them, Thane said. The war room was very quiet. Evelina had been standing still since Thane sat down, and she continued to stand still now, because what was moving through the room had a quality she recognized from the documents she'd read in her father's study. The particular atmosphere of something that had already happened that you were only now fully understanding. The 2 Senate sources. People Kael had cultivated over years, people whose families existed somewhere in the Empire's ordinary fabric, now dead because a man who had shared 11 years of fieldwork with Kael had decided the shape of his ambition required it. Kael turned from the table. He walked to the window that looked out over the mountain approach, and he stood there with his back to the room, and the silence had a weight that was different from his usual silences. Take him to the lower garrison, he said to the 2 men standing at the door. I'll deal with this later. Thane stood. He looked at Kael's back, then at Evelina, one more time, with the expression of a man who has accepted consequences and is measuring them against something internal. For what it's worth, Thane said, I didn't think he'd kill them. Get him out, Kael said. They took him out. Kael stood at the window for a long time after the door closed. Evelina didn't speak. She understood, from reading him in the past 2 days, that there were things he needed to process that did not benefit from external input, and that her presence was not unwelcome exactly, but that the silence was doing necessary work. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the specific texture of betrayal when it came from someone you had built something real with, the way it retroactively contaminated the memory of every decision made in trust. She thought about her father and understood that she and Kael were standing in the same landscape from different positions. Finally, he turned from the window. The Northern Intercept team, he said. Lucian knows their positions. He'll have sent riders. How long before they're compromised? If he sent the riders when the Senate session ended, 12 hours from now, maybe 10. Pull them back, she said. If I pull them back, your father reaches Ironcrest. My father is going to reach Ironcrest regardless, she said. Corvath is still holding in the south. If you commit the intercept team and Corvath activates, you lose the team and my father gets resupplied. At least if you pull them back, you still have the people. He looked at her. She could see the calculation running in his face. Not whether she was right, and they both knew it. Something else. The specific calculation of a man being asked to give up a position he has held for months and accept the reconfiguration it requires. If your father reaches Ironcrest, he said, the northern campaign becomes a siege. 6 months minimum. I know, she said. The Emperor doesn't have 6 months to spare on a stable situation, let alone an active siege. I know, she said again. He looked at her steadily. What are you proposing? She had been thinking about it since she read the dispatch. She had been thinking about it with the part of her mind that her father had spent 22 years cultivating, the part that read maps and read rooms and read language for what it was hiding beneath what it said. She hadn't wanted to use that part of herself for this purpose. She was using it anyway. Lucian needs the Northern Campaign, she said. He needs it to activate the emergency powers and position himself as the military leader the Empire requires. Without an active rebellion in the North, the Senate's authorization holds, and he can't expand his command authority. Yes, Kael said. Then you can't let him have it, she said. Not the clean version. If my father reaches Ironcrest and digs in, that's the campaign Lucien wanted, a prolonged northern siege that keeps your military assets tied up while he consolidates the capital. So what removes that option? She held his gaze. I do, she said. He went very still. I'm the Arden heir, she said. The fortress acknowledges my authority. Not legally. My father is still the title holder. But the garrison commander has served my family since before I was born. Half the internal staff remember my mother. If I walk through those gates before my father does, the fortress politics change. You'd be walking into a situation where your father is 3 days behind you with a contingent of armed men and a functioning conspiracy. Yes, she said. And Lucien's emergency authorization means Imperial troops can move north within 48 hours of the Senate session. Yes. Evelina, don't, she said. Don't tell me it's not safe. I know what safe looks like, and this is not it. And the alternative is letting my father use my family's home as the anchor for a war that kills everyone I grew up with in the northern villages. He looked at her for a long moment. The window light behind him was white and cold and very clear. I can't put a full protective detail with you, he said, not without flagging the movement to Lucien's network. I know. 4 men, he said. My best 4. They don't leave your sight. Agreed. And you wait inside the fortress walls. You don't engage your father directly. You hold the position until I can move the 3rd Legion north under new command. New command, she said. Thane commanded the 3rd. Thane commanded the 3rd, he said. Yes. She understood what that meant. The 3rd Legion, without its commander, in the middle of an active political crisis, required someone to take the posting immediately. Someone Lucien didn't have leverage over. Someone the Legion's officers would accept. She looked at Kael. You're going to lead it yourself, she said. It's the only option that doesn't lose the Legion to Lucien's network in the transition period, he said. Which means you're in the field, she said. Which means you're not here. Yes. The war room held them both in its cold morning light. Outside, the mountain was doing what mountains did, existing with the complete indifference of something that had been here before all of this and would be here after. Evelina thought about her father moving north on the road to Ironcrest. She thought about 2 dead Senate sources and Thane's voice saying, I didn't think he'd kill them, with the specific flatness of a man who had known exactly what he was enabling and had found a way to live with it in advance. She thought about Kael at 22, watching her family from whatever distance he'd chosen, making a decision she still didn't fully understand. She thought about walking into a fortress where her father would arrive 3 days behind her, and what she would say to him when he came through those gates and found her already there. When do we move? She said. Kael turned back to the map. Dawn tomorrow, he said. If we're going to do this, we don't give Lucien time to adjust. She nodded. She was already thinking about the garrison commander. His name was Aldous. He had gray eyes and had taught her to ride when she was 7 years old, and had once, when she was 14 and her mother was 3 months dead, sat outside the library door for an entire evening without speaking, just present, because he had understood that was what she needed. She was going to use that. She was going to use every piece of knowledge she had about every person in that fortress. She was going to use the 22 years her father had spent teaching her to read rooms and read people and give nothing away. She was going to use all of it, and she was going to do it in her father's own house, for the first time in her life, for herself. And somewhere south of the mountains, in a garrison cell with cold stone walls, Edric Thane was sitting with the particular company of a man who has bet everything on a calculation and is only now beginning to understand the full cost of being wrong. Dawn came over the Varros range like something being forced open. Evelina was already dressed when the light hit the fortress walls, standing at the war room window with her traveling coat on and her hair done plain in the specific stillness of someone who had made a decision in the dark and was waiting for the world to catch up with it. She had slept 3 hours. She had spent the 4th lying on the cot in the room they'd given her, staring at the stone ceiling and going through the Ironcrest layout in her head, the way her father had once taught her to memorize a strategic map, not by trying to remember it, but by walking it, room by room, wall by wall, until the space existed inside her as completely as the original. She knew that fortress. Every passage, every courtyard, every face that worked its halls. That was going to have to be enough. Kael found her at the window. He was already in field gear, the black operational armor she'd first seen him in at the cathedral, and he had the focused economy of motion of a man who had been awake for hours and had finished all his preparations and was now simply ready. He set a folded document on the table beside her without ceremony. "What is this?" she said. "A letter of authority," he said, "executed under my seal and signed by 2 senators from last night's session who are not in Lucien's column. It identifies you as acting under imperial counter-authority and gives you legal standing to command the Ironcrest garrison in the event your father's forces attempt to compel loyalty by force." She looked at it, then at him. "You prepared this before I proposed going." A pause. "Yes," he said. She picked it up. "You were going to send me regardless." "I was going to ask you," he said. "When the situation was clear enough to ask correctly. You got there first." She didn't know what to do with that. She folded the document and put it inside her coat. "The 4 men," she said. "Waiting in the courtyard," he said. "Corvan leads them. He's the best close protection operative I have. He doesn't talk much, but he thinks faster than anyone I've worked with in the field. Trust his read on the room." She nodded. He looked at her for a moment. The war room was cold and very quiet, the mountain outside holding the early light in the particular way of high places, clear and without softness. "Your father will arrive at Ironcrest in approximately 48 hours, he said. "I need 72 to move the 3rd Legion into position. That's a 24-hour window where you're holding the fortress with 4 men and a document." "I know the math," she said. "Evelina." She looked at him directly. "Don't engage him," he said. "Don't let him draw you into negotiation. Your father is very good at making conversations feel like they have multiple outcomes when they don't. Hold the garrison commander's loyalty, hold the gates, and wait. And if he gets through the gates before you arrive?" He held her gaze. The answer to that question had several versions, and none of them were comfortable, and they both understood that, and neither of them said it. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded once. Then she picked up her gloves from the table and walked toward the door, because standing still was not something the next 72 hours could afford. "Kael," she said at the door. He looked at her. "Come back from the field," she said. "Don't be stupid about it." Something crossed his face. The faintest version of the expression she'd been cataloging across 4 days. The one that didn't have a name yet, but that she was increasingly certain was the most honest thing about him. "I'll make every effort," he said. She left the war room and walked down into the courtyard where 4 men were waiting, and the fortress gates opened around her and the road to Ironcrest began. She reached Ironcrest on the morning of the 2nd day. The northern road was faster than she remembered from childhood, or perhaps the difference was that this time she wasn't being carried in a family carriage with the long, comfortable rhythm of a journey that had no urgency behind it. Corvan pushed the pace without being asked, and she matched it without complaint, and the 4 men around her moved with the professional quietness of people who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had learned to conserve everything that didn't serve the immediate function. She thought about Kael moving south with the 3rd Legion, absorbing command of a military body that had spent 11 years answering to a man who had just been revealed as a traitor. The officers would have questions. Some of them would have loyalties that needed to be tested and either confirmed or burned. Some of them would have taken Lucien's coin the way Thane had. Kael would know how to find them. He had been doing exactly that kind of work his entire adult life. She thought about her father on the road north, with his contingent and his contingency plans, and the specific determination of a man who had decided the outcome before the situation had fully developed and was now simply executing against a timeline. She knew that quality in him. She had grown up watching it. She understood now, inherited a version of it that she had never fully named because naming it would have required acknowledging how much of herself came directly from him. The thing she had decided in the dark, in the 4th hour of lying on the cot at Nightgrave, was that inheriting something from a person did not obligate you to use it the way they had. That was going to have to be enough of a philosophy for now. The fortress came into view on the morning's 2nd hour, rising out of the northern plateau the way it always had, black and gray stone against a sky the color of old iron. The Arden banner was still flying from the primary tower. She had been watching for that. Corvan rode up beside her. "Your read?" he said. First words he'd spoken in 6 hours. "The banner means the garrison hasn't been contacted yet," she said. "My father's riders would have pulled it down and replaced it if they'd gotten here first." "How confident?" 70%, she said. "Aldous keeps that banner up in all weather as a point of principle. If he'd been compromised, the first thing he'd do is take it down to make the transition look voluntary." Corvan looked at the fortress. "And the other 30%? "He keeps it up because he knows I'm coming, and he wants me to think exactly what I just told you." Corvan was quiet for a moment. "You sound like him," he said. She knew he meant Kael. She didn't answer. They rode through the outer gate at mid-morning. The portcullis was up, which meant either welcome or trap, and she held her spine straight and her face composed and rode through it the way her father had once ridden through a dozen uncertain gates, like the outcome had already been decided and she was simply here to confirm it. Aldous met them in the inner courtyard. He was older than she remembered. They always were. 60-something now, with white hair and the gray eyes she'd been thinking about since Nightgrave, and he looked at her for a long moment before he did anything else. The look of a man taking a full accounting of what he was seeing. "Lady Evelina," he said. "Aldous," she said. She dismounted without waiting for assistance. "We need to speak privately. Immediately." He looked at Corvan and the 3 men behind him. At the road south. At the banner above the primary tower. "Yes," he said. "I expect we do." Basset. She gave him the full picture in 40 minutes, sitting across from him in the garrison commander's office with the letter of authority on the table between them and Corvan standing at the door. She told him about the compact, about the Senate session and the emergency powers, about Kael's operation and Thane's betrayal, and her father moving north on the road with 40 men and a plan to use this fortress as the anchor for a war that the Empire couldn't survive. She did not tell him about her mother. That was information for a different conversation, and she wasn't certain it would survive the weight of everything else she was asking him to carry. Aldous listened without interrupting. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. "Your father endowed my appointment," he said, 12 years ago. "I know," she said. "Half the garrison officers have served under Arden authority since before you were born." "I know," she said, "and you're asking me to close the gates against him." "I'm asking you to hold the gates until the 3rd Legion arrives," she said, "which gives my father time to stand down rather than commit to something that ends with this fortress destroyed and everyone in it facing Imperial charges." Aldous was quiet. "He won't stand down," he said. "No," she said, "he won't. But holding the gates gives him the choice, which is more than he's offered anyone else." He looked at her for a long time, the gray eyes doing the same work they'd always done. Steady and thorough, not rushing to a conclusion before the evidence was fully weighed. "Your mother would have done exactly this," he said. She held that. Let it sit without flinching. "Tell me what you need," Aldous said. Uptempt. The next 36 hours were the longest of her life. She reorganized the garrison with Corvan's input and Aldous' authority, pulling the officers whose loyalties were uncertain into roles that kept them visible and occupied and away from the gate mechanisms. She had the secondary grain stores Aldous didn't know about sealed from below. She walked every passage she'd mapped in her head at Nightgrave and confirmed 3 that had been partially blocked by renovation work and 1 that had been fully bricked over sometime in the past decade, which changed her evacuation calculation, and she revised it accordingly. She slept 4 hours on the first night in her mother's old chamber, which still smelled of the dried herbs someone kept replacing in the wardrobe, and woke with her hand on the knife Corvan had pressed on her in the carriage, with the instruction to keep it on her person until this was finished. On the morning of the 2nd day, a rider came through the northern gate with her father's seal on a folded note and the specific bearing of someone who expected the message he was carrying to solve the problem rather than deepen it. The note was 6 lines. Her father's handwriting, precise and practiced. "I know you're there. I know who sent you. Whatever he's told you, there is a version of this that ends with you safe and the family intact. Open the gates. Let me come in. Let me explain. You owe me that much." She stood in the gatehouse with the note in her hand and thought about the cathedral corridor, his hands on hers, the recalculation she'd seen in his face. She thought about the clause in the annex. She thought about the passage her mother had used to leave the fortress unseen, and why. and what her mother had been carrying out of this place that required invisibility. She folded the note. "Tell him," she said to the writer, "that the gates open when the 3rd Legion arrives, not before." The writer left. Corvin was behind her. She didn't look at him. "He'll move up his timeline," Corvin said. "Yes," she said. "He'll be at the outer walls by nightfall." "Yes," she said. "The 3rd Legion is 12 hours out," Corvin said, "as of Kael's last dispatch." "12 hours is a long time," she said. "Yes, my lady," Corvin said. "It is." Hence. Her father arrived at the outer walls 3 hours before dark. She watched from the battlements as his contingent deployed across the approach road with the efficiency of men who had been briefed on what they were doing and why. 40 men, she counted. Some in Arden livery, some in what looked like Imperial courier uniform that was either genuine or very good approximation, which told her Lucian had given her father some level of official cover for this movement. The prince was hedging. If this worked, he had a loyal instrument in Ironcrest. If it didn't, the men in courier uniform gave him plausible distance. Her father rode to the midpoint between his line and the outer wall and stopped. He looked up at the battlements. She was visible on them, and she hadn't tried to be otherwise. "Evelina." His voice carried clearly in the cold northern air. "Come down." She said nothing. "This doesn't have to be what it looks like," he said. "Come down and we'll talk." "We can talk from here," she said. A pause. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the cathedral corridor, the full accounting, the recalculation. From this distance, she couldn't read the details of his expression, but she knew its architecture. "You've been with Varros for 4 days," he said. "Whatever he's told you is constructed to position you where he needs you. You understand that." "He told me about the compact," she said. "I read it myself. 3 days before the cathedral." A longer pause. "Then you know I built this for you," he said. "Everything in that document was built to secure your position in the new structure." "The annex," she said. "The clause that transferred me to the prince as a contracted consort. That was for me." The wind moved between them. "It was a political instrument," he said, "not a life sentence. Once the structure was established—" "My mother," she said. Silence. Absolute flat silence from the approach road. "Kael knows," she said. "He's known for years. He doesn't have proof that will hold in a court against your legal resources. He told me that directly." She paused. "But I don't need a court. I need to understand if it's true." Her father was very still on his horse. Below her, across 50 yards of cold northern air, he was doing the thing she had watched him do her entire life, finding the configuration that served the moment best. She was going to go to the Senate, he said. She'd found the early correspondence, the first alliance letters. If she'd taken them to the wrong people at the wrong time, everything I'd built for 20 years would have— "Stop," Evelina said. He stopped. She stood on the battlements and felt the cold and looked at her father and understood that she had been right in the carriage. There was no version of this that made it something she could live with. He had loved her. She believed that. He had also built his love around her the way a wall was built around a strategic position, and when her mother had threatened the structure, he had done what he did with all strategic threats. She understood her father completely. That was the worst part. She had spent 22 years being taught by him how to think, and she was now using every tool he'd given her to see him exactly as he was. "The gates don't open," she said. "Not for you. Not tonight." His face changed. Not the recalculation. Something older. Something that she recognized as close to grief, but that in him had a different texture. The grief of a man who has lost something he classified as his. "Then I'll take them," he said. "Try," she said. "Untek." They hit the outer wall at full dark. Not 40 men. More. He'd had a reserve contingent staged in the forest line to the east that Corvan had identified 90 minutes earlier and reported without alarmism, which was one of the things she was finding she valued about Corvan. He didn't perform urgency. He delivered it as information and let her do the calculation. 60 men against a garrison of 80 with a fully defensible wall system would ordinarily not be a contest worth having. But her father knew this fortress, and he had clearly identified where the construction renovation work had compromised the eastern parapet's integrity, because that was where the first real pressure came. Evelina was already there when it happened. She had moved to the eastern section an hour before dark because the bricked-over passage she'd found in her reconnoiter ran directly below it, and she had spent 3 years of childhood trying to understand why it had been blocked. She understood now. It was the original service tunnel to the cliff road. Her father had sealed it, not because it was structurally compromised, but because it was the passage her mother had used, and he had sealed it the way he sealed everything that threatened the edges of what he'd built. The eastern parapet held. Barely. The garrison fought with the particular intensity of men who were defending something they had spent their lives inside, which was a different quality of determination than men fighting for a principle. Corvin held the central section, and she held the eastern section, and Aldous held the gate mechanisms, and they held all of it, for 1 hour and then 2, in the cold and the dark and the sound of iron on stone. She took a cut across her left forearm in the second hour from a grappling hook that swung wide and connected before she moved far enough clear. Not deep. The kind of wound that burned and bled enthusiastically and did not stop her, but that she was aware of in the specific way you were aware of physical damage in the middle of a situation that required you to keep functioning regardless. She pressed the sleeve against it and kept her position. It was during the third hour, in the relative stillness of a brief pullback while her father's men regrouped at the base of the eastern wall, that the first distant sound reached her, a specific percussion, low and rhythmic, coming from the south. Horses, a lot of them, moving fast. Corvan appeared beside her. "They're here," he said. She exhaled, the breath she'd been half-holding for 36 hours. The 3rd Legion hit her father's contingent from the South Road like something that had decided the outcome well in advance and was simply completing the formality of the execution. She watched from the battlements in the cold dark as the disciplined machinery of an Imperial Legion deployed against 60 men in a field, and she understood watching it, why the Empire had spent 30 years being afraid of the man commanding it. Kael moved through the engagement the way he moved through everything, without wasted motion, without theatrics, with the complete and terrifying efficiency of someone who had looked at every possible variable in advance and had simply arrived at the one that worked. She couldn't see his face from the battlements. She didn't need to. Her father's men broke in 15 minutes. 15. She watched them break and scatter and watched the Legion contain the scatter with the calm mechanical precision of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Her father didn't run. She had expected him to. She had been calculating what the running version looked like and what it required from her and from Kael and from Aldous, who would have opinions about the pursuit of a man he'd served for 30 years. She had the contingency mapped. Her father sat on his horse in the middle of the approach road while his contingent dissolved around him and watched the Legion deploy and did not move. He had the bearing of a man who had lost the engagement and was absorbing the fact with the dignity of someone who had never been able to afford the luxury of coming apart in public. The Legion surrounded him. She watched. Then she was off the battlements and through the gate and crossing the approach road, because this part was not something she was going to watch from a distance. She reached the inner perimeter of the Legion's containment ring as Kael dismounted. He looked at her arm first, the cut, the blood-soaked sleeve, and his face did the hard thing, the colder absence. "It's not serious," she said. He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned to her father. Lord Aldrich Arden sat on his horse in the torchlight of the containment ring and looked at his daughter and at the Duke of Varros standing beside her, and his face had a quality she had never seen on it before. Not the recalculation, not the political architecture, something stripped of all that, something underneath it that was just a man in a field who had lost. "Dismount," Kael said. Her father dismounted. "You'll be held at the garrison under Imperial authority pending formal charges," Kael said. "The Senate session gave Lucian emergency powers for the Northern campaign. I'm operating under counter-authority executed by the Senate minority. Whether that holds legally will be determined by the Emperor's direct intervention, which I intend to request within the week." Her father looked at Evelina, not at Kael. "He'll never love you," he said. "Not the way you want. Not the way she deserved." A pause. "Men like Varros don't know how." She held his gaze across the cold ground between them. "You killed her," she said. "That's the only thing that matters right now." Her father's jaw worked once. Then he was still. "Take him," Kael said. 2 Legion officers moved in. Her father went with them without resistance, with the composure of a man who had been preparing his entire life for the version of events where everything came apart and had made his peace with it long in advance. She watched him go. The torchlight moved on the approach road, her father's figure receding into the controlled dark of the containment perimeter, and the cold of the northern plateau pressed in around her from all sides. She became aware that Kael was standing very close. She turned. He was looking at her arm. He had a field dressing in his hand, the kind kept in operational gear, simple and effective, and he held it out without speaking. She took it. Her hands were steady. She was surprised to find they were steady. "The Prince," she said. "The Senate session authorized the Northern campaign. He'll be watching this." "Yes," Kael said. "When this reaches the capital, he'll know the Northern option is gone. He'll move against you directly." "Yes," Kael said. "Which means the Senate," she said. "He'll go for the remaining opposition in the Senate. Vale first, then the Ardenmere bloc. Within the week," he said, "before you can get back to the capital with the 3rd Legion." "Probably," he said. She looked at him. The torchlight was behind him, and his face was in partial shadow, and he looked like what he was. A man who had been moving at full operational capacity for 4 days, who had just commanded a field engagement and absorbed the betrayal of his closest professional associate and ridden through the night to reach a fortress in the northern plateau, and who was still, somehow, completely present. "What's the move?" she said. He looked at her, and what she saw in his face in the torchlight was not the controlled compression, not the hard, colder absence. It was something she hadn't seen before, and that she didn't have a name for yet, but that had the quality of something long held finally arriving at a place where it didn't have to be held anymore. "There's a senator," he said, "on Lucien's side, one who has been on Lucien's side since the beginning, whose vote has been decisive in every movement the prince has made in the past 6 months. Without that vote, the emergency authorization fractures. The Senate opposition can call for review. The emperor can be reached." "Which senator?" she said. "Vael," he said. She stared at him. "You said Vael was playing both ends. You said he voted against the full authorization." "He did," Kael said. "Specifically so he could deliver something more valuable than a vote to Lucien. He voted against the full authorization to maintain the appearance of independence. Without that appearance, 3 other senators who follow his lead would have broken from the bloc, and Lucien wouldn't have gotten even the partial authorization. She absorbed that, the architecture of it, the patience required, a man manufacturing the appearance of opposition so he could deliver it at the precise moment it was worth the most. Vael is the keystone, she said. Remove him from Lucien's column, and the entire Senate strategy collapses. Yes, Kael said. And you've known this for how long? Long enough, he said. Why haven't you moved on him? He looked at her. The silence between them had the specific weight of something he had been deciding whether to say for a long time. Because Vael has documentation, he said. A contingency file, held by 3 separate legal custodians with instructions to release it simultaneously if anything happens to him. The file contains documentation of every significant operation I've run in the past decade, every shadow decision, every instance where I moved outside formal imperial authority to neutralize a threat, protect an asset, remove a dangerous actor. She held very still. It would destroy you, she said. It would expose everything I've built, he said, every network, every source, every person who trusted me with their cooperation. He paused. And yes, it would destroy me, probably in the literal sense. The approach road was very quiet. The Legion was completing its containment work at the perimeter, efficient and distant. The banner above the primary tower moved in the night wind. She looked at him. There's a play, she said. There's a play, and you've been working toward it. You don't tell me something like that just to describe a dead end. He held her gaze. The file's custodians, he said. One of them is a legal officer in the Senate Registry. One is a private solicitor in the 4th District. One is a notary in the Imperial Palace Administrative Wing. And you know which one is weakest, she said. I know which one made a bad financial decision 14 months ago and has been managing the consequences quietly ever since, he said. Yes. She understood the shape of it, pressure in the right place, applied correctly, before Lucien could move on the Senate opposition. Remove Vale's insurance and Vale became vulnerable. Make Vale vulnerable, and the keystone moved. But doing it required getting into the capital before the prince moved, before the week was out. With the 3rd Legion committed to the northern containment and Kael's network partially exposed through Thane's betrayal and her father's arrest, triggering every remaining compact instrument in the Empire to evaluate their position and decide which way to fall. She looked at Kael in the torchlight and understood what he was about to say. You need someone Lucien isn't watching, she said. Someone who moves through the capital without triggering his network. Someone with legitimate access to the Senate building and the palace administrative wing and the social architecture of the 4th District. He said nothing. Someone who is supposed to be a contracted consort, she said, who has a name that still opens doors in the capital regardless of what her father just did. Evelina, don't, she said. Don't tell me it's not safe. We've had that conversation. He looked at her. And the thing she'd seen in his face a moment ago, the something long held finally arriving, was there again, clearer now, and she understood looking at it that it was not a new thing. It had the quality of something that had been present for a very long time and had been managed and compressed and set aside in the service of other priorities, the way he managed everything, the way a man managed the only thing he had never been able to fully control. The capital in 4 days, she said. The notary first because he's the most exposed. I know his office. I've had documents certified there twice. She watched Kael's face. And then we deal with Lucien. She watched something move through him, something that was not agreement exactly, not the operational confirmation of a plan, something more than that and older than that, something that had been waiting for a version of her to exist that could stand in a field in the dark on the far edge of the Empire and say, and then we deal with Lucien and mean it as a fact rather than a hope. You understand what dealing with Lucien looks like, he said. Yes, she said. It's not a Senate maneuver, he said. The prince has gone too far to be walked back through legal architecture. When we take the keystone out from under him, he'll act, directly and fast, before the structure collapses around him. I know, she said. He'll come for you specifically, Kael said, as the most direct pressure point available. I know, she said. Let him. Something shifted in the air between them. The distance that had been professional and operational and deliberately maintained across 4 days of crisis compressed, very slightly, in the cold dark of the northern plateau, with the torchlight moving on the approach road and the banner above the tower moving in the wind. 4 days, Kael said. I need 2 days to hand the 3rd Legion to a temporary command structure and arrange the capital approach. You'll travel separately, ahead of me. Corvan will stay with you. Agreed, she said. He looked at her arm again, the field dressing she was still holding. She started binding the cut herself. He watched her for a moment. Then, with the same deliberate care he applied to everything, he reached out and took the dressing from her hands and finished the job. His hands were very steady. She already knew they would be. When this is over, she said. He tied off the dressing, didn't look up immediately. When this is over, he said. She didn't finish the sentence. Neither did he. The space where it would have gone held something better than words. The specific quality of 2 people who have been moving toward the same point from different directions and have just, for the first time, looked up and seen each other across the remaining distance. And in the capital, 4 days south, in a palace where an emperor was dying and a prince was watching the northern reports with the calculating attention of a man whose best-laid plan had just been disrupted, Crown Prince Lucien was making decisions that would require the blood of everyone who opposed him. His patience had an end. They were almost at it. She reached the capital on the 4th day, as planned, 2 hours before dark. Valdenmere looked the same from the eastern approach road. That was the thing about cities. They absorbed catastrophe the way stone absorbed weather, showing the damage only in the specific places where the material had finally given, everything else continuing its ordinary business with the indifference of scale. The Baker Street was still there, the vendors on the processional avenue, the palace towers catching the last of the afternoon light against a sky that had gone the color of pewter, the same as the morning it all started. She rode in with Corvan and 2 men and the kind of face she had been practicing since childhood. Give them nothing they can use. The notary's office was in the administrative quarter, 3 streets from the palace's secondary entrance, in a building that smelled of old paper and lamp oil and the particular dry stillness of a place where people came to make things legally permanent. She had been here twice, as she told Kael. She knew the clerk at the front desk. She knew which inner office handled the high-value custodial work. She knew the notary himself, a compact, careful man named Eredith, who had managed the quiet anxieties of the capital's upper administrative class for 20 years, and who had, 14 months ago, extended a private loan to cover a gambling arrangement that had gone wrong, and had been paying the interest on that mistake in ways that went beyond the financial ever since. She sat across from him in his inner office with the door closed and Corvan outside it, and told him what she needed with the directness her father had always called her greatest liability, and that she now understood was simply the most honest tool she had. Eredith looked at his desk for a long time after she finished. "If Vael finds out," he said. "Vael will have other problems by the time this matters," she said. "And if the prince, she said, is the reason you want to move quickly." He looked up. "Lucien is cutting instruments that have outlived their usefulness," she said. "You've been useful to Vael. Vael has been useful to Lucien. When Lucien moves on the Senate opposition, Vael becomes a liability. When Vael becomes a liability, everyone Vael has leverage over becomes leverage that can be picked up by someone else." She held his gaze. "Or it can be dissolved. Tonight. Before the sequence starts." Eredith was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened the lower drawer of his desk and removed a sealed document case and set it on the desk between them. "I need written confirmation," he said, "of the counter-authority, what you showed me. I need it on record somewhere that isn't controlled by anyone connected to this." "I have it," she said. She placed the letter of authority on the desk. Kael's seal. 2 Senate signatures. He looked at it. He picked it up. He spent 40 seconds reading it with the careful attention of a man whose profession was the detection of legal weakness, and found none, and set it down. He opened the document case. The second custodian, the private solicitor, was easier. He had never wanted the file in the first place, had accepted it as a professional obligation to a long-standing client, and when Evelina explained the political geography of the next 72 hours with the calm specificity of someone who had spent 4 days living inside it, he made the calculation a man makes when he understands that the storm is coming regardless, and the only remaining decision is whether to be holding something when it hits. He surrendered the documents inside an hour. The third custodian was in the Senate legal office, which meant getting into the Senate building after dark, which meant using the service entrance that the kitchen staff used, and that Evelina knew from 6 years of attending Senate functions with her father and watching, always watching, because her father had taught her that the way to understand a building was to understand how it was serviced, not how it was presented. Corvan got them through the service entrance. She got them to the right office. The legal officer inside it looked at her, and at Corvan, and at the documents she'd already collected, and made the specific face of a man who had known this day was eventually coming, and was simply relieved it had arrived before something worse. 3 custodians. 3 document sets. The insurance policy that had been holding Kael in place for months dissolved in 4 hours in the back offices of a city going about its evening. She was in the carriage heading to the safe house Kael had designated when the dispatch rider found them. Short message. His handwriting. In the city. Senate building. Come now. She found him in a committee room on the Senate's upper floor that had been cleared of its usual occupants by the kind of authority that didn't ask permission. 3 of his operational people were at the door. Moret was inside, at a secondary table, working through documents with the focused efficiency Evelina had come to recognize as Moret's version of controlled crisis management. Kael looked at her when she came in, and his eyes went to her arm first, the way they always did now, checking, and she shook her head slightly to tell him it was fine, and he moved on. "Vael?" he said. She set the document case on the primary table. He looked at it, then at her. "All 3. She said. He was quiet for a moment with the quality of a man absorbing something he had been working toward for months and was only now allowing himself to fully register. "Lucien moved 3 hours ago," he said. Senator Corminth. He's been taken into custody under the emergency authorization on fabricated charges. The Ardenmere block has gone to ground. They're in the building, in the lower chamber, but they're not moving without some kind of signal that the situation has changed. Vael is the signal, she said. Yes, he said. If I present this file to the Senate floor with the block present, Vael loses his position tonight. The block can call for immediate review of the emergency authorization. The Emperor can be reached through the review process. It's one of 3 legal mechanisms that bypass the prince's authority. Then do it, she said. Lucien will know within the hour, Kael said. He's been watching the Senate building since the session ended. When this moves, he'll act directly. Against you, she said. Against both of us, he said. You're carrying a letter of counter-authority with my seal. In Lucien's current legal framework, that makes you a co-conspirator to imperial disruption. She looked at him steadily. I've been a co-conspirator since the carriage out of Valdenmere. That's not new information. He looked at her for a long moment. The committee room was lit by 4 lamps, and it made the shadows work differently on his face, softer at the edges, which was not a quality she associated with him, and that she was finding she didn't mind. I need you to stay in this room, he said, with Marais, while I take the floor. I know, she said. He picked up the document case. He looked at her once more, the full accounting, the look she had spent years calling assessment, and now understood was something else entirely, something that had been present since before she had the language for it. Then he walked out the door and down the corridor toward the Senate floor, and she turned to Marais, and they waited. The Senate floor took 40 minutes. She heard the shape of it through the walls, the percussion of elevated voices, the specific acoustics of a large formal chamber absorbing a confrontation that had been building for months. She couldn't hear words. She heard the rhythm of argument and counter-argument, the formal procedural cadences breaking under the weight of something too immediate for procedure to contain, and then a different quality, the sound of a chamber arriving at a decision. Marais looked at the door. It's holding, Marit said quietly. She had been listening to senates longer than Evelina had. The block is moving. Then the sound changed, not inside, outside, in the corridor, the specific sound of men moving at operational pace, not the measured footstep of Senate security, something with a different intention behind it. Corvin came through the door hard. He sent men in, he said. 8, through the eastern entrance. They're coming for the Duke. Evelina was already moving. She came out of the committee room into a corridor that had resolved itself into a very simple geometry. Kael at one end, coming back from the Senate floor with Vael's exposed file still in his hand, and 2 of his operational people around him. 8 of Lucien's men at the other end, in Imperial Guard uniform, with the bearing of people who had been given a specific order and intended to complete it. And Crown Prince Lucien himself, standing in the corridor's center, with the expression of a man who had made a decision about how this ended and was here personally to ensure the execution. He was in formal court dress, which told her this was planned as a public action, something that would be witnessed and recorded and framed in the morning as the legitimate suppression of treason. He had the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed this. He looked at Kael, then at Evelina. Lady Arden, he said, or I suppose that title is complicated now. Your Highness, she said. You've had a busy 4 days, he said. Your father is in garrison custody. The Compact's northern strategy is finished. And now you've apparently been helping Varros dismantle the legal framework that authorizes my emergency powers. He paused. I'm going to need you both to come with me. Kael said nothing. He was looking at the 8 men with the professional evaluation she recognized, counting, measuring, calculating the geometry of the corridor. The Senate has voted for review of your authorization, Kael said. It's on the record. 8 men in a corridor don't change the vote. The vote can be revisited when the Senate understands the full scope of what you've been doing in the Empire's shadow for the past decade, Lucien said. And they will understand it once Vael presents what he knows. Vael's documentation has been surrendered, Evelina said. The prince looked at her. All 3 custodians, she said. Tonight, before you moved on Corminth, which means you moved too slow. Something changed in his face. Not the careful composure. What was underneath it, briefly visible. The cold, flat look of a man recalculating with fewer variables than he'd arrived with. "Take them," he said to the 8 men. Kael moved. She had seen him move in the cathedral, through smoke and opposition, with the specific economy of someone who had made violence a professional instrument and had long ago removed everything from it that wasn't function. She had not seen him move in a confined space against 8 men, with nothing between him and the outcome except the quality of his own decisions. It lasted 4 minutes. She was not the kind of woman who looked away. She watched every second of it. Korvan and the 2 operational people taking the flanks. Kael through the center with the precision of something that had been refined past the point where effort was visible. 3 of the 8 were down before the rest understood the geometry had changed. 2 more in the following 30 seconds. The last 3 made individual calculations and arrived at the same conclusion and stood down. The corridor was very quiet. Lucien had not moved. He was standing in the center of the corridor with the specific stillness of a man who had expected a different outcome and was revising his understanding of what he was standing in front of. Kael walked toward him. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at the prince with the look she'd seen him use in the war room, the map-reading look, the complete absence of feeling that meant complete attention. "The review is on the record," Kael said. "The Emperor will be contacted through the legal mechanism within the hour. Whatever you do in the next 30 seconds, the vote exists." Lucien looked at him, then at Evelina, then back. "You've destroyed everything," Lucien said. His voice had lost the formal architecture. What was underneath was younger than she expected, and angrier, and something close to genuinely lost. The Empire needed a strong succession. It needed someone willing to act before the whole structure collapsed under a dying man's. "The structure didn't need you to kill for it," Kael said. "It needed you to be worth it." The corridor held that for a moment. Then Lucien reached for the short blade at his side, the movement of a man who has run out of other options and is choosing the final one. And Kael's hand closed around his wrist before the blade was half drawn, with the same completeness of everything else he did, the same absence of wasted motion. "Don't," Kael said. Not a threat. Something quieter than a threat. The word of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that some moments were better ended than completed. Lucien looked at him. Something moved through the prince's face, the full understanding, finally and completely, of what he had been measuring himself against and what the measurement had returned. He let go of the blade. The Emperor was reached before midnight. He was lucid, the physicians reported, for the first time in weeks. The review mechanism had required the removal of the specific members of the medical staff who had been managing his regimen, and without that management, the Emperor was simply a dying man who was still, underneath the dying, the same person who had held the Empire for 31 years. He received Kael in the private study off the throne room, which Evelina knew from the account Kael gave her afterward because she had not been in the room and had not asked to be. That conversation was his to have. She understood the weight of it without needing to witness it. What she knew was the outcome. Lucien's emergency authorization was dissolved. The prince was remanded to a formal proceeding to be convened when the Emperor's condition permitted. Vial was removed from his Senate position pending investigation. Senator Corminth was released within the hour, and Kael walked back out of the private study with the specific quality he had after every significant event, neither more nor less than what he had been going in, which was, she was coming to understand, what genuine composure actually looked like. Not the absence of being affected, the presence of something strong enough to hold the weight of being affected without changing shape. He found her in the antechamber outside the study. He sat down next to her on the stone bench, which she had not expected. He was not a man who sat unless the situation required sitting. He sat, and the corridor was quiet, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "How is he?" she said. "Tired," Kael said. "Clear. He knew most of it, more than we thought." A pause. "He asked about you." She looked at him. He asked if Lord Arden's daughter was who had come through the Senate building tonight with the custodial documents. Kael was looking at the corridor wall. "I told him yes. He said..." A pause. "He said your mother would have done the same thing." The antechamber was very quiet. She breathed through it, let it sit, did not look away from it the way she had been looking away from certain things for 8 years and had been slowly, in the past 4 days, learning to stop. "Did you know her?" she said. "My mother, before." "I met her twice," Kael said, "at court functions. She was—" He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him find the word with the care of a man who did not use words carelessly. "Exact," he said. "She was very exact about what she thought and what she was willing to accept and what she wasn't." "She sounds familiar," Evelina said. She felt him go still beside her. The specific stillness, not the hard, cold one, but the other kind, the one that meant something was being fully registered. "Yes," he said, "she does." 3 weeks later, the war was over. That was not quite accurate. The war had been over since the Senate review, since Lucien's proceeding began, since the imperial legions in the eastern and central provinces received the formal communication that the emergency authorization was dissolved and their standing orders reverted to direct imperial command. But the specific quality of over that meant the bleeding had stopped and the rebuilding could begin took 3 weeks to settle into the fabric of things. Evelina was in Valdenmere for most of it. She worked with the Senate Relief Committee on the northern villages that had been caught between her father's contingent and the 3rd Legion's advance. She worked with the displaced household staff from 3 noble houses whose lords were in proceedings. She found, in the working, that what her father had taught her about reading rooms and reading people was extraordinarily useful for the business of understanding what people needed and how to get it to them, which was possibly not what he had intended the education for, but was what it was for now. She went to see her father once, in the garrison facility where he was held pending trial. He looked older. Not because he was suffering. The facility was adequate, and he was being treated with the formal dignity his title still technically afforded him. He looked older because something that had been holding his face in a specific configuration for as long as she could remember was no longer doing that work, and without it, he was simply a man in his 60s who had made decisions that had unmade him. She sat across from him in the visiting room, and they looked at each other for a long time. "I'm not going to ask you to understand," he said. "Good," she said, "because I don't. I'm going to ask you to believe that I know you loved her," she said. "I know you loved me. I know those things are true. They don't change the other things." He was quiet. "The trial will be thorough," she said. "I won't interfere with it. I won't advocate for or against the outcome. Whatever it returns is what it returns." He looked at her with the gray eyes she had her whole life tried and failed to fully read. "You're going to stay with him," he said. "Yes," she said. "He's not—" He stopped, started again. "He'll keep you safe. I'll grant him that. He's kept you safe your entire life, which is more than I managed at the end. The specific grief of a man measuring his life's work against its results. But he's not built for the thing you're going to want from him." She looked at him steadily. "He's been building toward me for 13 years, she said. "I think he knows how." Her father looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands on the table between them, and something went out of his face that had been the last structural remnant of the man who had built the compact and signed the annex and done what he had done to her mother. What was left was just her father, diminished and exact and still, in the complicated way of things that were true simultaneously, someone she had loved. "Go," he said. "Don't come back here unless you want to. Don't do it out of obligation." She stood. "I'll come back," she said, "when I'm ready." She left the visiting room and did not look back, and the cold air of the street outside hit her face, and she breathed it in and let the grief and the anger and the complicated residue of 22 years occupy the space they occupied, without trying to resolve them into something cleaner or easier to carry. Some things you didn't resolve. You learned the weight of them, and you carried it differently over time, and eventually the carrying became part of how you moved through the world. And that was what passed for healing when you were being honest about what healing actually was. She found Kael at Nightgrave in the 4th week. He had returned to the fortress after the capital work was done, to handle the 3rd Legion's formal command transition, and the operational cleanup that followed any significant disruption to a network as extensive as the one he'd built. She had come back because it was where the next conversation needed to happen, and they had both known it needed to happen without saying so directly, which was, she was learning, one of his primary modes of communication, stating things through the architecture of his actions rather than the architecture of his words. He was in the war room. He was always in the war room. She suspected that, when the political crisis was fully resolved and the Senate proceedings were complete and the empire had settled into whatever its new shape was, he would still be in the war room because the war room was where he understood himself. She was going to change that. Not by removing the war room, by adding something to the architecture of his life that the war room couldn't contain. He looked at her when she came in. The full accounting, the look that had never been assessment. She knew what it was now. She had known for a while. The Senate convenes the formal commission next week, she said. The Reconstruction Framework. Yes, he said. They're going to ask you to serve as military commissioner. I know. Are you going to? He was quiet for a moment. I haven't decided. She walked to the map table and stood across from him the way she had stood across from him the first morning in this room when she had read Thane's dispatch and begun to understand the shape of everything that had been hidden in plain sight. I'm going to rebuild the northern villages, she said, properly, not as a relief project, as a long-term infrastructure commitment. Schools, medical stations, the cliff road repaired so the valley communities have reliable supply access through winter. He looked at her. That requires political cover, she said. Senate authorization and military security during the construction period because the northern territories are going to be unstable for at least a year while the succession proceedings work through. Yes, he said. It also requires someone who understands the operational architecture of the region, she said. Who knows which commanders are reliable and which ones are Lucian's residue and need to be replaced. Yes, he said again. His voice had the quality of someone who knows where a conversation is going and is choosing to let it arrive. I can't do it alone, she said. He looked at her across the map table. The lamps were burning steady and low, and the mountain outside was doing its patient, permanent thing, and the war room was very quiet. No, he said. You can't. She held his gaze. So stop deciding whether to serve as military commissioner and serve as military commissioner. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, huh? It was the distant country that a smile came from, the suggestion of the territory rather than the territory itself. But she had been learning his face for weeks now, and she knew what it meant. You sound like him, he said. Your father, when he was teaching. I know, she said. I've decided to keep the tools and change what I build with them. He was quiet. Kael, she said. He looked at her, fully, without the operational management, without the compression. The way she had seen him look exactly once before, in a northern plateau at night with torchlight moving on the approach road, all the way through. 13 years is a long time to carry something alone, she said. The war room held the silence between them. Outside, the mountain wind moved around the fortress walls with its low persistence, the sound of something that had been there before all of this and would be there after. Yes, he said. It was the quietest thing she had ever heard him say, stripped of all the architecture he usually built around his words, just the word itself and what it had been holding underneath it for a very long time. She walked around the map table. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him and let everything she understood about the past 4 days and the past 13 years and the specific, irreducible weight of what it cost a person to do, what he had done, exist between them without trying to manage it into something easier. He looked at her. His hand came up and touched her face with the same deliberate care he gave to everything. The care of a man who had spent his entire life being precise about things that mattered and was being precise now about the thing that mattered most. I don't know how to do this, he said. Yes, you do, she said. You've been doing it for 13 years. You just weren't allowed to finish. Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically. He wasn't built for drama. She understood that now as a fundamental quality rather than a limitation. It broke open the way old fortresses broke open when they were finally no longer needed for defense, carefully, with the specific dignity of something that had held for a very long time and was choosing to release rather than collapse. He pulled her in and held her the way the fortress held the mountain, like something that had been designed for exactly this purpose from the beginning and had simply been waiting for the conditions to be right. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the cold of his field gear and the warmth under it, and breathed in and let the 4 days and the 8 years and the 22 years and the grief and the anger and the love that was complicated and the love that was not complicated at all settle into their respective weights and sit there, held, manageable at last. Outside, the empire was doing what empires did after the blood dried, and the proceedings concluded and the flags were changed. It was finding its new shape. The Senate Commission met. The northern roads were measured for reconstruction. The succession moved through its legal channels toward an outcome that would take time and not be clean but would hold, the way things held when the structure was sound. In the war room at the top of a volcanic fortress, a man who had spent his entire life building walls held a woman who had spent her entire life learning to read them, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the silence was not the absence of words. It was the presence of something that had finally found its right place. The most dangerous man in the empire had spent 13 years fighting the entire world in silence for one reason. She finally understood it completely. She had understood it for a while. She was done pretending otherwise. 1 year later, they called her Duchess Varros. She was still learning the weight of that name when the Senate Commission delivered its first annual report on the Northern Reconstruction. The numbers were better than projected. The cliff road was open. 3 schools had been built. 2 more were under construction. The valley communities had sent a formal letter of gratitude to Nightgrave that Aldous had received with the gray-eyed composure of a man who had served 2 generations of a family and was quietly glad to see the 3rd generation accounting for itself. Kael served as military commissioner. He was still feared. She had accepted that this was not a quality that would dissolve with peace. It was structural, built into the way he occupied space and made decisions and looked at a room. But feared was not the only thing he was, and the people who worked close enough to know the difference had begun to understand that. She watched him one morning in the war room, which was now also the planning room, the correspondence room, the room where the reconstruction maps lived alongside the military charts. He was reading a report from the valley communities, and his face had the absorbed completeness of a man doing work that mattered, and something in the set of him was different from the man she'd met in the cathedral corridor. Not softer, exactly. Less compressed, like something that had been held under great pressure for a very long time and had been gradually, carefully, allowed to exist at its natural dimensions. He looked up and found her watching. She did not look away. He set the report down. "The Eastern School needs a qualified teacher," he said. "The senator from the Ardenmere block has a candidate." "I'll meet with her this week," she said. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment in the particular way that still, after a year, did something to her breathing that she had given up trying to manage. "You're not afraid of me anymore," he said. "I was never afraid of you," she said. "I was afraid of what I might feel if I looked at you directly." He was quiet for a moment. "And now?" he said. She picked up her correspondence and sat down at the planning table and looked at the maps of the north, the roads and villages and schools being built in the places where the fighting had been, and she felt the weight of everything it had taken to arrive at this ordinary morning in this room with this man, and she let herself feel it completely rather than in pieces. "Now I look directly," she said. He returned to his report. Outside, the empire of Norval continued its complicated, imperfect, ongoing work of being a place where people lived. The corruption was not gone. It was never gone. It was a recurring condition of power that required perpetual attention, not a problem to be solved once and shelved. The succession would be difficult. The Senate would have bad years and good years. The Northern Territories would take a generation to fully recover. None of that was finished. But the woman who had spent 22 years being moved by other people's plans was sitting at a table making her own, and the man who had spent 13 years fighting in silence for something he was not allowed to name was sitting across from her, present and unhidden, in the ordinary light of a morning that belonged to them both. That was not a small thing. That was, in the end, the only thing.